Good morning. This is Crystal Woods with Seasons in the Vine, and it's Fresh Friday. And today is the close of the Esther series. You've done it. You have walked through the book of Esther and done a deep dive into what was going on historically at that time and how the amazing providential hand of God moved in this one book of the Bible, the one book of the Bible that doesn't mention God at all. And yet we see his hand in the places where you don't even know that he could be, but working everything out for the good of his people according to his will. And he had a will for the Jewish people. He had a plan. He was bringing his son, the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ, through them. And so when threat came that they would be annihilated, God steps in. And like typical, over and over and over again, he's using people to get his will accomplished on the earth. Okay, so let's do it. We're going to do 9 and 10 today because 10's like this big. And we're going to get through this meaty part here, this very ending of lots of action. Chapter 9, Esther chapter 9. Now, in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on that very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. So remember, this would be the original edict that was telling the enemies of the Jews, you can go ahead and take them out. This was Haman's evil plan. Now the king has sent out something else, also saying, like, guess what? The Jews are going to be allowed to fight back. They're going to be allowed to destroy, annihilate, and plunder. Now, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. I love that. And I just love, I'm in the ESV, and I love that phrase there, the reverse occurred. What the enemy intended for evil was flipped. The reverse occurred. And those Jews that were supposed to be annihilated and taken over and plundered will now be gaining mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them. Praise God. No one could stand against them. Just reminds me of how we see in Romans 8 that, what can separate us from the love of God? And all of these things, you're more than a conqueror. Like, who can be against you when God is for you? So good. Check out Romans 8. And verse 3. Oh no, let's finish up 2. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all the peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. And what's interesting here is that we see even the government agents and the people higher up in the empire are coming to the assistance of the Jews. So awesome to see that protection and that provision. Verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's house. The favor that Esther and Mordecai have, I talked about it last week. This is just astounding favor. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. Now, that's an interesting phrase there. Nobody really had too big of a breakdown other than to say, like, this doesn't mean that they were doing things that were evil or like outside the bounds of God. It just means that if those people came against them, they were able to shut it down, whatever way they needed to shut it down. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Now, these would be the people that were trying to kill the Jews. They would be the ones that still wanted to try to take them out. Now, listen to this group of names and bear with me here. The citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Now, listen, they also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Porath and Dahlia and Aridatha and Parmashata and Arasai and Aradai and Vezatha. Lots of Athas. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, maybe where all those Athas would be coming from, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. They weren't interested in what those people had. So what we see here is justice being enacted, not just on what happened to Haman, which happened chapters ago, but even his children are now standing opposed to them, and they have been killed. All 10 as a way of retribution and shutting down that family line. And we do see that annihilation is something in the Old Testament to rid an enemy fully and completely from being a problem in the future. Verse 11, that very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? So they did this much here. What else have they done? Now, what is your wish? So much favor. The king, even though all this has occurred, is still okay with her having more. It shall be granted you. And what further is your request, it shall be fulfilled. Just abundant favor. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. Give them one more day of this triumphant victory over their enemies. Let them continue to do what needs to be done. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. Well, we know they've already been killed, which then proves the point that I was making several weeks ago, that the gallows were not, the impaling was not a way for someone to die, but it was actually used after the person was dead as a symbol and reminder to everybody else, don't do what they did. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Once again, we're not seeing a desire that the Jews have at all to take from the enemy. Now, the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but laid no hands on their plunder. So the king, Ahasuerus, says they're allowed to take the plunder, but they don't. And nobody really had a clear answer on this in all of my research, other than it just wasn't what they were after. It was really more about the preservation of themselves as a people group. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day, they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and the 14th. Remember, Esther petitioned they would have 2 days. So then they rested on the 15th day. That's why there's a difference in when everyone was celebrating. And they made that 15th day in Susa the day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. Okay, let me break there real quick and make sure I've gone through everything. When the day of destruction of the Jews came, the tables turned, and the enemies of the Jews, it was flipped around on them, and they were destroyed. Even the government officials came to their aid. What we see here is God's sovereign hand intervening, and Mordecai is now in a position of great authority, and he has great precedence over the people and the things that they're doing, the decisions they're making. See if there's anything else. Their motives are different. Where Haman's motives for the wealth and the plunder were coming from that evil place, the Jews don't have that desire in this situation to do that at all. Like, that isn't the goal or the aim. Let's see if there's anything else. It's a 2-day feast in order to remember, this was a 2-day feast in order to remember the goodness of God working through many different circumstances to protect his people from extinction. Now this feast we're getting ready to hear about is called Purim. Because of Haman's use, I'm going to give you a little pretext here. Because of Haman's use of pur, which was the casting of lots. Remember, he cast lots to figure out when the day of extinction, when the day of this horrible attack was going to take place, to determine the time of the exact execution. All right, next, let's see. I think that's it. Let's get back into it. Verse 20, and Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month they had turned from them for them from sorrow into gladness. Remember how absolutely horrified they were what was going to happen. They turned into great days because of God moving through Mordecai and Esther through King Ahasuerus to shift this entire thing a different direction. And that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written for them. Now you have to remember, so this Feast of Purim is not in the Mosaic Law. This is not something God told them to do. This is not part of like the Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles. This was something they added in themselves, the Jewish people. Mordecai had written about it, and so they did it. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on its own head. I love the reversal language we see consistently in Esther. And that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So remember, the gallows is not, even though the language is just all off here. It's a large wooden pole that someone would be impaled on. So that's the kind of hanging that's happening. We always think like around the neck. But also this person would be dead when they were put on the gallows or this big impaling pole. Verse 26, therefore they called these days Purim, and after that term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and of what had happened to them, the Jews finally obliged themselves and their offering and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at that time appointed every year that these 2 days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So you can see they're making a commitment to remember God saving them from destruction. Verse 29, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed and at their appointed season, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and their lamenting. Now, the fast, the lamenting, you remember how they put on the sackcloth and ashes. There was fasting going on to seek the protection of the king, to get her an audience before the king. Verse 32, the command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. So that's how, even to this day, this is a feast that some Jews will still celebrate. I think that's it. Okay, final thing. Chapter 10, King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. Now that's kind of bizarre. Why is that? Oh, but remember, he lifted the taxes earlier on in Esther in a way of like this just good greeting and wonderful time. He lifted the taxes, but now back to business. The taxes are put back in place. And what this shows is the tremendous strength and authority that he had in his kingdom. And all the acts of his power and might and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So documented somewhere else. For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all of his people. And so what we see here is Mordecai is in this high position, totally the hand of God, even though nothing directly says that. But we see that's what Esther gives us, is this look of like, even when they're in a foreign place, even when they're in an ungodly kingdom, God's people were supernaturally protected because God had a plan for those people, and his plans will prevail. And that's what we can take to the bank. All right, so takeaways. God will sovereignly and providentially work in many circumstances to accomplish his will. It's about his will. Queen Vashti was a Persian queen, but she was disposed of her position to let a Jew, not that he knew that she was a Jew at the time, but a Jewish orphan, Esther, into that high status position. And God did that so that she would be able to be in that position to save her people for such a time as this. For those once held high like Haman can be brought low, and those who are low can be brought high. It's about God and what he is doing and what his plans are. Decrees that are meant to destroy and come against God and his people can be overturned. The reverse happened, the reverse occurred as God works in the hearts of people, even those like King Ahasuerus, not a Christian, not a Jew, not someone serving the Lord, but God worked in his heart and he didn't even know him. God can use anybody he wants at any time. Ultimately, God is working his will out on the earth through whatever means necessary. But will you be in this generation on the earth? Will you be the Esthers and the Mordecais who say, God, I'm right here. Use me to preserve your people, a remnant. Use me to further your kingdom. Use me to bring your will here on earth as it is in heaven. Will you be the Esther and the Mordecai of your generation? Much love, and thanks for coming along on this journey. See you next time.